Hey folks, it's been a minute since I've made a video, but this stuff doesn't pay the bills, so I don't really have a schedule to follow. I do have a little bit different project to work on this week, so I thought I'd try and bring you along and see if I could document it on here. A couple of friends of mine have got this little late 60s Chevy 2 drag car that they've put a 572 cubic inch big block in it, and they need a set of headers. So maybe I'll try and set this camera up and see if we can get that on video. Now, I'm not a professional header builder or exhaust guy by any means, but I do frequently get requests for, headers that you can't just buy off the shelf, usually quite custom. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that I've had to build several sets of headers for my own projects, like this thing, which you're not gonna buy a set of off-the-shelf headers to fit in this chassis. So this was probably my third or fourth set of headers that I ever built to fit in this rig. And you get practice doing stuff like this, and that stems into people requesting that you build a set of headers to fit their project. Now this car is a little different. It's not like this is a totally custom deal. A Chevy 2 with a big block, there's headers out there for it. About 800 bucks from Summit you can get some, but I was requested to build these headers. So here we go. I've started by bolting the flanges onto the heads where they belong. I've got the tires turned in there so that I can kind of scope out how much room I've got. I'd like to give them as much steering as possible. Granted, this is a drag car. Normally goes straight, but you still got to drive the thing around. So I got a plan in mind. I just got to start cutting tubes and making stuff fit. Now I usually always start with a header weld-up kit of some kind. Like this one here, I nearly just tripped over. This is from Hedman. I've usually always started with a set of these. I believe these ones here, they refer to as just a weld-up kit for a chassis car, or maybe a set for like a dyno header. It just gives you a variety of bends and whatnot you can just start with, kind of play around with some stuff. I usually always have the customer grab me a half a dozen J-bends because those always come in handy as well. Now, one thing I will note, the first set of this header weld-up kit that I ever bought was probably in 2005. And it seems to me since then the quality has really kind of gone downhill as far as like their tooling marks and stuff on there. I've bought probably a half a dozen of these weld-up kits, and in the last 5 years, the quality is just not really as good as what I remember before. But still good enough to pump exhaust through, so that's what we'll start with. So I've got this first tube tacked up in place. For me, it's always the first one that's kind of challenging. Once you get that first one in there, then the rest just have to follow along and fit in there. So it might look kind of odd that I've chosen to pick a middle tube and start building off of that. But that was the one that I felt needed to fit so I could follow along to still have steering angle and make everything fit the way I feel it should. Thought I'd take a minute and show you. I kind of lucked out on this tube, so it looks like I have one joint, right? I've got one area I had to splice the tubes together, and I've made one of those original primary tubes fit. Sometimes you get lucky like that. That's why I like to have a header kit to play around with that. Unfortunately, we've got this tooling mark right here where everyone's gonna see it when it's all done, but maybe we can butter that up a bit. Right here I'm using a couple of magnets to hold these two tubes together while I give them a little tack here and there. That works pretty good, other than if you try to get too close, that magnetic field does some pretty strange stuff when you're trying to tack that stuff together. Obviously that probably wouldn't work with stainless either. These are just mild steel headers, so it works pretty good for this case. So now I've got that primary tube right down to where the collector is going to be at. Time to work on the next one. And here we've got tube number 2 in place. From primary tube, tucking back up under that tube there. Come back here where the collector will be under the floor. I'll go ahead and bolt that tire back on and do a little mock-up and testing, set it back on the ground. Make sure we got the clearance we're shooting for. Get a little video of that when I get it back down on the ground. So here it is on the ground. The tire turned full lock. And we've got about, 1/8 of an inch in there before the tire rubs on the header. Guess it's possible to touch in a bump, but pretty good for a drag car, I think. So the plan for the next tube, I'll come over the top of the first primary with this second primary and take it right over the outside of that middle primary tube. Then the last one will actually go up over the top, so there'll be 3 wide back here right at the firewall. And then it'll come back under and tuck in to finish off at the collector. It's not going to do itself, so I better get back after it.
A few moments later.
All right, it's a new day. Before going home last night, I got this third tube tacked in place. Looks like it's going to work out. Now I just got to fish one more primary in there from that back port on down to the collector area and keep room for a tire. See what we can get done.
6.5 hours later.
I am already several hours into this project, but that's just kind of the way it goes when you're doing headers. No point in rushing it, they're just time consuming. So I do have all 4 primary tubes tacked into place. Everything's looking really good there. But before I get into how that's looking and showing you what's going on there, I figured I'd take a minute and go over the tooling that I use. None of it's anything special, but I thought some people might be curious on what I use or what they might need if they were going to tackle this project. This is going to seem pretty rudimentary, but let's start with the basics. Measuring and marking. You know, aside from a tape measure, a metal scale actually comes in pretty handy sometimes. So I always keep one of those in my pocket, a good Sharpie, and then one of these bracelets. If you go to the dollar store and buy these kids bracelets, snap bracelet, you actually cut that jacketing off of there and you end up with a nice spring steel wrap. And that's good to have a couple of those in the toolbox. If you need to make a cut on here, you can actually wrap that around there just like a plumber's pipe wrap or a pipe fitter's pipe wrap. Now you can take your Sharpie and mark a nice straight line around that piece of tubing. This comes in pretty handy. You mark that all the way around, especially if you're cutting it with something with like a bandsaw or making sure that your chop saw is cutting nice and straight. I use this trick a lot for even fabricating tube, like tube chassis stuff, anything with round tubing. I think that's a must. Okay, I've got my measurements made, got the tube marked. Next step would obviously be cutting. So I use one of two options to do that. For straight cuts, anything, you know, just lopping the leg off, getting down to the corner, use my old 14-inch cold saw there. That does a good job. If I'm feeling froggy, once in a while, I'll turn the table there, maybe make an angled cut. Sometimes that gets a little bit hairy, especially if you're trying to cut in the middle of that radius. There's days where I feel if you're not careful there, you might wind up making a video on YouTube about being an amputee. So actually, for most of those cuts, I just use the old Portaband there, clamped in the vise with the Harbor Freight foot pedal to control it. That's a little bit safer, but it works pretty good. Very functional. Once the tube is cut, the next thing I do is basically deburr it. Take them gnarly, jagged edges off of it, like this, and that's what the old disc sander there is for. Knock the rough stuff off, halfway clean it up. Then I'll come over, a little bit of wax and grease remover in the spray can there. Works really good for removing the oils that come on this tubing. You pull them out of the bag, they're nasty, kind of oily stuff. Keep it from rusting for the most part. Wax and grease remover works pretty good for taking that stuff out. Once that's done, grab a flat disc on the die grinder, deburr the inside, clean it up. You want to take actually quite a lot of care in cleaning the inside of your cuts. Get rid of all of that oil, all the nastiness, mill scale, because when you go to weld the outside of this, it will draw that nastiness from inside the tube into your weld. Nobody wants that. I can use all the help I can get, so I try to make sure the inside of those tubes are clean as possible. Here you can actually see I have quite a selection of what looks like maybe mess ups or scraps. There really are not a lot of mess ups here. These become tools. If they don't work, they still work. If it doesn't fit where you want it, you can actually use that to get an idea of, you know, grab this one here. I go to put it in place and it has too much angle. Well, then I know I need to cut one with a little less angle. I could grab this one with less angle and test fit it and see how it works. It's really convenient if you start a new set of headers, if you have a box of these things laying around. It's a really good starting point to get the project going. Now, the parts are all cut, cleaned, deburred, ready to tack this stuff together. This actually is one of the most challenging things when I'm doing this stuff. Being a one-man show 99% of the time down here at the shop, when you're trying to hold these pieces of tubing together, that can be really challenging when you're here by yourself, especially when I want to tack this thing together with the TIG. Now, if I'm just using the MIG welder, you know, wire feed, no problem. Hold her in place, give it a spot, we're good to go. But lately, I've been doing a lot of my tack up with the TIG just to make it easier when I do finish welding later on. I know they make really cool clamps. I see them on advertisements on Facebook and Instagram all the time. You know, this is a good example of where that doesn't really work very well because the clamp and the band is so wide to get on some of these short radius or, you know, these short coupled joints. It can be pretty challenging. So a lot of times I keep a, you know, pretty large assortment of magnets laying around. These magnets work pretty good. For example, like I want to put these couple of bends together. Slap a couple magnets on it. And it'll hold that piece in place long enough for me to get a tack on there. Now keep in mind, magnetic fields create some wonky stuff when you try tacking stuff together. So I've got this held in place where I want it. I come in here with my TIG torch and try and put a tack right here next to this magnet. You're going to be presented with some pretty good challenges. Can't really explain it. It's some funky stuff. So obviously don't put magnets where you need to put a tack. Get them in there where you can. You can put a tack right there, no problem. Nothing to it, right here. Easy peasy. Then you pop the magnets off, throw a couple more tacks in place, and it isn't going anywhere. Like these magnets here, different thicknesses, different heights. This one right here, I could slap that one between two primary tubes and wind up with, you know, where they cross each other, end up with an 1/8 inch of clearance between the two tubes. Again, if I got them laying around to hold stuff in place, hold clearance where I need it, it just works out. And that's how I do it. Now, what I use to stick this stuff together is my Miller Multimatic 220 multi-purpose machine here. This is pretty handy because a lot of times when I'm tacking that first primary tube on, I will use the wire feed because you are doing the one-handed hold it, give it a spot tack. That works really convenient for sticking it on there real quick. The other good side of it is that you give it that little bit of a pop, you know, give it a little tack. It doesn't burn in that great, especially on that 3/8 plate. So when I go to disassemble these things to do all of the finish welding on those butt joints, usually I can get those tacks to pop loose pretty good off the header flange and disassemble the whole header, weld it up, and actually use those tacks kind of as a reference to get stuff kind of sort of lined back up as I go back together with it for the final time. Now, I've never MIG welded a set of headers together, but I've seen a lot of them done that way, and I would never discourage anyone from doing their own set of headers, even if all they have is a MIG machine or a wire feed. Give it a whirl. You're going to be out a couple $100 in tubing, and you're going to learn a lot. I have always TIG welded the primary tubes together, and 99% of the time I will TIG weld the flange to the primary tube as well. There have been a few cases where it was easier just because of the fitment and whatnot to where I actually MIG welded the inside of the primary tube to the inside of the header flange. It's a pretty rare case, and they've worked out. It works okay. So here we are. I've got the driver's side all tacked into place. You can see clearance is pretty tight, but I knew that going into this project. It's pretty much the reason this car is out here. This car, when it was a small block car before with small tube headers, it had an issue with the tires rubbing on the headers at that time. So now it's got, these are actually 2 3/8 primary headers into a 4.5 inch collector, I believe. So pretty big stuff in a pretty small package. For the most part, I'm really happy with how it's turned out, and I think the owner of the car will be happy with them as well. I'll get this thing up in the air and pull the tire off again, and then show you a little more before I start taking everything apart to finish weld those primaries. And here you go. Like I was talking about, these 3 wide across the back, you know, keeping everything tucked back against the firewall as close as possible. There's probably about 3/8 of an inch back here clearance on the closest point. And they come down here, have to swing together, where eventually it will all go into the collector. This tube here will get cut off to match the other 3. Cap that star in the center, and it will be ready for the collector. Of course, that all comes after I take each individual primary tube off and weld up every joint. A lot of times I really try to limit them to maybe 2 or 3, you know, like this first one here ended up with 1 single butt weld in the center there. Unfortunately for me, the rest of them are like 4 for each tube. That's kind of just the way it is with this car. Not a whole lot, you know, not shooting for style, nothing like that. Just point A to point B with enough clearance to clear everything in between. Try to keep the primary tubes as close to the same length as I can. Getting started on this second side, I thought I'd take a minute and show you these magnets actually in use, as if it wasn't clear enough before. So to start with, I've got my 1 MIG weld here holding this tube pretty well firmly in place. Got 3 magnets here at this joint, one on the back side and these 2 here. And then I have a magnet down here on the firewall holding the bottom of the tube. So this is essentially just like having a second set of hands, hold that thing in place while I work on my fitment down here. That's pretty much where I want it, so I'll come back, throw a couple tacks here on this joint, do what I can to hold this piece in place, get it cut to length and fit up. I can tack that tube, those 2 tubes together there, and that primary right there will pretty much be done. Now this being the second side, I can jump back and forth from driver's side to passenger side and try to actually make these headers as symmetrical as possible while still keeping the primary tubes the same length, within reason anyway. So if I keep plugging away at it, I guess these things will be done before I know it. Or in a couple days, whichever comes first.
1 eternity later.
Well, fortunately, it did not take several days to get the passenger side done. Just one good long one. And once I get my mess cleaned up here, I can pop each primary tube off, get them all finished welded out. Ended up with a box full of miscellaneous bends and radiuses for the next time, and a bunch of straight legs to go in the scrap bin. Get this mess cleaned up and carry on. Now I've got my mess cleaned up and it's time to weld up all of these primary tubes. There's a little more to it than just taking each individual tube off and bringing it over to the bench and welding up all of these joints. Anytime you're going to weld up a tube like this, it's a good idea to back purge the back side of the weld or the inside of the tube. And by doing that, I have a spare bottle over here and regulator. And then if I remember right, this is like a shift boot off of a 13 speed or something laying around the yard, but it works pretty decent. Fit inside this tube here, roll it into place. Now this thing hangs on, I can flop it around and my gas line stays hooked up. Now on the other end, you're going to want to block that off somewhat. Not completely block it off, but pretty simple. Take a little masking tape, cover the end of the tube. Doesn't have to be 100%, just block it off good. Then I take a piece of, this is probably, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds filler rod. Maybe a little more, maybe 40 thousandths. Sharpen it up, and then I just poke some holes in there like a salt shaker. That way, when I turn the bottle and the regulator on, I get a little bit of gas flow through the inside of this tube. That keeps from getting kind of a crusty, sugary weld on the back, on the inside of this tube. And it's also better to, helps keep the impurities that I was talking about earlier drawing in from the inside of this primary. So yeah, now I'm ready to set it up in the vise, a little bit of wire brush action on each one of these joints, and then I can start TIG welding this. Now before I throw you guys on time lapse and I get busy welding on all of these things, I thought I'd take a minute and talk about filler material. These tubes here are just a mild steel tubing, so there's nothing special as far as filler material goes. I go over here to my filler selection and go through, and I've got my aluminum, stainless, mild steel and some miscellaneous silver solder brazing rod stuff up there. This is actually what I'm after right here. That right there is just MIG wire. You ever be welding along and your wire feed just spits and sputters and you realize that your spool is empty and you've got that extra 10, 12, 15 foot of wire that's stuck in your whip? You got to roll that back out of there when you change your spool. I always roll it up in a roll, throw it on the peg on the wall, and use it for filler material on this these thin tubing and sheet metal projects. You kind of got to feed it pretty fast, especially if you're using 030 or 035, but it's better than throwing it away, and it works pretty good. In that last clip, you can see once all 4 of the primary tubes were completely welded out, I bolted the flange back onto the head and then plugged each primary tube into their respective places. Then tacked each tube in place using 2 tacks right at the header flange, and then tacked the collector end of each primary tube together in their square pattern that they are. Then the whole complete header come out of the car, back on the bench where I have more work to do over here. So first thing, once this header was back on the bench, I took this filler plate that was supplied with the header kit and got it welded into place. That's filling that gap between the tubes. The next step will be to come over here and come back about 1 inch from the end of the primary tube and weld each tube together in between, bringing that weld around, tying it into this weld here. So basically what it's going to do is once the collector is on and in place and everything is welded around it, this whole end of the header is going to be sealed up. And that keeps any exhaust leaks or actually drawing fresh air in through the collector area where it's not supposed to draw air in. If anything's going to be drawing air in, you want it to be scavenging from one of the other cylinders. Then up here on the flange end of the header, these holes through the flange are actually closer to 2.5 inch. So that means my 2 3/8 primary tubes have a little bit of gap in between here. So what I do, since this thing is tacked into place really good, I'll take a ball peen hammer, use the round end, and kind of form the end of that tube, just basically flaring it out to meet this flange better, taking away that gap so I can TIG weld this really clean and seal this primary tube off to the header. Then the last step before it goes in the car again is to run about 1 inch bead on the bottom and the top of each primary tube. And that's mostly just a little bit of added strength. Since there are no exhaust hangers, there's nothing else holding this header up, just that flange bolted to the head. And that's pretty much how this thing will be the rest of its life. Now all I gotta do is sit down, finish welding that stuff up, then it'll go back in the car and get fitted for the collector. And here you can see I just MIG welded the primary tubes there on the outside, and I used the MIG welder here as well on the collector end. That's mostly just because I don't want to have to sit there and reach down in that crack and feed a bunch of filler rod in to stick a couple primaries together. The MIG works plenty good for that. So now back on the car it goes. I've got both headers bolted onto the engine, and I've got both collectors tacked on where they need to be. And as you can see, the fitment on here is, well, it's kind of crap. There's a big old gap in here. These things are just kind of roughed into shape. So what I do is I get the collector slid on in place, pointed where I want it. And then I find an area where, you know, it actually is contacting the primary tubes. I don't know if you can see it, but I put a tack weld where it's actually touching that primary. This one here, got it tacked right there. Now what I'll do is take this chisel that I've unsharpened, kind of rounded the end of it off there, get it set up on the bench, and I'll do my best to try and form this collector to fit those primaries a little bit better. So now I'll take the headers back off, over to the bench, and do my best to make them collectors fit a bit better. Now here you can see after I've worked it over with that punch a little bit, that gap in the corner is a lot more manageable. Got a little bit on there too. But I'll get this side welded out and kind of roll it around, work on all of them, get them as best I can. Go ahead and weld it up. Now, as you probably noticed in that last clip, I went ahead and just MIG welded those collectors onto the primary tubes. And the biggest reason for that was mostly because the fit and finish on those collectors was crap. There's nothing more I can say about it. Even after clamping and hammering and beating them into place, they didn't fit terrible, but that wasn't a good fit up for TIG welding those parts on there. So I went ahead and MIG welded them. I have no concerns about those being MIG welded on there. The set of headers that are on the buggy, those flanges and collectors on there were 100% MIG welded on over 15 years ago. That set of headers has seen more heat cycles and more abuse than almost any other header that I've ever built out there for certain. So I have no concerns with that. The appearance, they look good. I'll show you how they all turned out before I end this video, but I did want to take a minute and do a little comparison with the headers that I built for the Midnight Panic truck, just so you can get an idea, a difference maybe of some of the parts. This set of headers here started out exactly the same as the ones I just completed. 2 3/8 Hustler weld-up kit with a handful of Hooker headers J-bins. There's two major differences with this set of headers though. First one being this collector. The collector that comes with the Hedman kit is a 4.5-inch collector, and this one is a 5-inch collector. If I remember right, this is a Hooker headers collector. I bought it from Summit, but the fit and finish on it was so much better that I was actually able to TIG weld that onto the primary tubes. It just fit so much better. I had to work on it a little bit, but the fit was good enough to TIG weld once I was all done. The next major difference is the header flange up here. Now, as you can see, that's a big block Chevy bolt pattern, but it's on a Ford head. So to get it to clear the spark plugs and all that fancy stuff, I had to cut my own flanges out here. And since I got to cut my own flanges out, I actually made them fit the primary tubes like they were supposed to. So then again, as you can see, I was able to TIG weld those on there. And overall, just a few minor changes can make the fit and finish so much better. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Now I've got both these headers bolted on this car, but as you can see, the collector turned out pretty good. You shouldn't have any trouble with that. Now I can put the tires back on this car and get it on the ground and kick it out of here. My part of this one is done. I didn't intend for this to be a how to build headers video. This is more of a how I build headers video. If you stumble across it and you see something you might want to try, or maybe something you might want to avoid, or even maybe you're just trying to wrap your mind around how come your local fabricator wants to charge you 3 times the amount of money that a set of off-the-shelf headers would cost. I'm sure you'll find a little bit of all three in this video. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.